Every story has a beginning. Mine started with a rumor. Whispers about experiments conducted at this psychiatric hospital, pushing me. Boundaries of humanity were just one of many conspiracy theories I had heard during my journalism career. But there was something about this rumor, something different, darker. Taking a sip of my coffee, I was scanning old newspapers on my screen when I found my first clue about this rumor. Ashwood Psychiatric Hospital, which abruptly closed in the 1970s and never reopened. On the surface, it was written off as abandoned due to financial difficulties and management errors. But between the lines, there was more. Reports of patients disappearing, staff resigning in strange ways, and even a few doctors being admitted to the hospital themselves. Each one more bizarre yet equally intriguing. This story could win me a Pulitzer, I said to myself, a spark of excitement inside me. With a bit of research, I found the hospital's location. Deep in the forest, a few miles outside of town, it was now abandoned and left to nature's mercy. Once a terrifying refuge for people, it was now a spot frequented by adventure-seeking youths and ghost hunters. Something was pulling me there, as if there was a secret waiting for me. I did a bit more digging, trying to find the names of former staff, even trying to get access to the records. However, most of these documents were either lost or censored with black ink. Eventually, I decided to go. I informed my friends and colleagues, but no one took me seriously. Everyone saw it as just another weird Rachel project. But I wasn't just trusting my curiosity. I was trusting the intuition inside me. Before heading to the hospital, I made my preparations. A flashlight, spare batteries, a camera, a notebook, and a recording device. If I found something there, I was going to show the world. But if anything happened, I left a note in case I went missing so they could find me. When I arrived at the psychiatric hospital, the sun had already disappeared beyond the horizon. Night was falling, but since I started chasing this story, I had felt an unsettling feeling inside me. I parked my car a few hundred meters away from the hospital, in a hidden spot among the trees. I didn't want anyone to know I was here. The silhouette of the building loomed menacingly under the moonlight. Broken windows, old doors sealed with padlocks. But what truly caught my attention was the silence surrounding the building. Despite being in the forest, there were no birds chirping, no wind dancing through the leaves. The air was thick and suffocating. I examined the building from the outside for a while. The graffiti on the old walls were remnants of adventurers who had come here years ago. Some were just ordinary words, but a few were eerily repetitive. "You won't be able to leave. He's still here." I took a deep breath of cold air. "Don't be afraid, Rachel," I whispered to myself. I reminded myself that this was my job as a journalist, to uncover the truth. I took out my camera and snapped a few photos of the building. Finally, I noticed that the boards covering a small window next to the main entrance were loose. Away inside. I looked around. I was completely alone. I tightly gripped my bag and carefully climbed up to the window. It didn't take long for me to realize that the hospital had truly been abandoned the moment I stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and rotting wood. The dusty floor was evidence that no one had set foot here in years. With the beam of my flashlight, I scanned the area. Long corridors, peeled paint on the walls, wires hanging from the ceilings. It felt as though time had stopped here. I approached a door. An old rusted sign was still readable. Treatment Room A1. I pushed the door and it creaked open. Inside, there were metal gurneys, toppled cabinets, and files scattered on the floor. I pulled out my recorder and began taking notes. Although this place was closed years ago, All the traces are still here. The files, the belongings. It's as if someone left in a hurry. I opened one of the files. It contained patient reports with only a number, no name or age. But what caught my eye was the repeated sentence on every page. The experiment failed. When I directed my flashlight toward the floor, I saw darkened stains that looked like old blood. My stomach churned. Maybe the reason they left was because of the experiments, I thought to myself. As I moved down the corridors, the silence grew even more eerie. The only sound was the creaking of the floorboards beneath me. But suddenly, I heard a faint tapping sound coming from a room ahead. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I pointed my flashlight in that direction. "There's no one here," I whispered to myself, but the tapping repeated. This time, it was clearer. My heart was pounding. "This is an abandoned building," I tried to calm myself. Old pipes, rats, nothing else. But the tapping seemed to be getting closer. I turned around, but in the light of my flashlight, there was nothing. It felt as if a pair of eyes were watching me from the darkness. I took a deep breath, tightly gripped my notebook, and began moving toward the source of the sound. But there was a feeling deep inside me. I hadn't come here just to find a story. It was as if this place had come to find me. My footsteps echoed through the hallways. As I neared the source of the sound, the light from my flashlight began to feel insufficient. The darkness here was heavier, more suffocating. My hands were sweating, and my breath became irregular. I didn't know what I was going to find, but there was no turning back now. When I reached the door where the sound had come from, I noticed the sign above it. Surgical Intervention Room. Unlike the other doors, this one appeared almost completely intact. There was no graffiti, no broken hinges, no signs of rust. This only made me feel more uneasy. Before opening the door, I took a deep breath. I pulled my camera out of my bag and started recording. Rachel Kane. I'm in an abandoned psychiatric hospital, in the surgical intervention room. I've heard strange noises and am investigating. I noticed my voice trembled. I slowly pushed the door. It didn't creak. Inside, it was cleaner than I expected, but there was something unsettling about the cleanliness. The metal surgical table was still in place. The light hanging from the ceiling looked like it had been left there years ago. Beside the table were a set of surgical instruments, all of them rusted, but on the table, there was a leather notebook that looked almost new. I approached it carefully and picked it up. As I flipped through the pages, I noticed that the notes were written in neat handwriting. Experiment 52. Subject lost mental integrity. Displayed violent aggression within 12 hours. Experiment 68. Subject remains unconscious but alive. However, there is a subconscious awakening. As I continued turning the pages, the notes became more erratic and disjointed. We can't control it anymore. It's over us. This isn't an experiment. This is a nightmare. On the next page, there was only one sentence written in enormous letters. It found us. Suddenly, the door to the room slammed with a loud crash. I dropped the notebook from my hand and quickly turned around. The door was closed, and there wasn't even the sound of wind from outside. But the air inside the room had suddenly grown cold. My camera was still recording, and I directed my flashlight toward the door. There was deep silence, but I had a feeling. The feeling that I wasn't alone. "Who's there?" I shouted. My voice echoed off the walls of the room. There was no answer, but this time, instead of a tapping sound, I heard a muffled breath. I returned to the table, wanting to grab the notebook, But suddenly my flashlight began to flicker. It cut out a couple of times, then completely went out. My heart almost stopped. I fumbled through my bag, searching for a backup light. That's when I saw a shadow moving in the corner of the room. "Rachel, get out of here." The voice echoed as if it came from a great distance, but it was also so clear. My eyes widened and I stepped toward the darkness, shouting, "Who are you?" There was no response, but the shadow was moving toward me. At that moment, my flashlight came back on. There was no one in the room, but I could swear the shadows were watching me. I quickly grabbed the notebook from the floor and stuffed it into my bag. Something was terribly wrong. This place felt alive. As I left the room, the corridors had become even more suffocating. The pressure in the air felt like it was weighing down on me. My heart was pounding wildly as I began to run. At the end of the corridor, I saw a closed door. I thought I would reach it and get outside, but I was wrong. When I opened the door, I stepped into an even darker room. And then, the moment I entered the room, I felt that cold breath from behind me again. This time, it was much closer. The moment I managed to close the door, I felt that cold breath stop behind me. But this new room was even more terrifying than the others. The walls were old but strangely clean, as if time had stopped in this room. There was a table inside with a projector on it. The projector was running, casting an old image on the wall. I moved slowly forward. The mechanical sounds of the projector were unsettling. The image on the wall showed old hospital staff. They were all in white coats, smiling and posing for the camera. But one detail caught my attention. A man in the back row was different from the others. While the others were smiling, he was staring directly at the camera. His eyes were empty and dark. Suddenly, the image changed. This time, there was an operating table with a motionless man lying on it. The same notes appeared on the screen. Subject 68, unconscious, but awakening is near. A voice echoed, but it wasn't from the projector, it was from inside the room. A muffled and ominous voice. "He's still here." I began searching for the source of the voice, but the room was completely empty. The projector was still running, and the image kept changing. Now, it showed a group of scientists running around the room in panic. There was no sound recording, but their movements made it clear that something had gone horribly wrong. The scene on the screen suddenly jolted. This time, there was only one person in the room, the subject lying on the operating table. Slowly, he began to sit up. When his eyes locked onto the screen, my breath caught. Those empty, dark eyes seemed to meet mine directly. The projector suddenly shut off, and the room was plunged into pitch-black darkness. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Taking a deep breath, I turned on the light of my camera. At that moment, a silhouette appeared in the corner of the room. In the flickering light of the camera, it looked like a human figure. But it was not human. It was tall, its bones seemed to protrude. Its skin was a greyish colour, as if it had rotted and withered away over years. It was slowly approaching me with heavy steps. Its eyes were the same as the ones of the man in the projector image, empty and dark. I dropped the camera in my hand and began running toward the door behind me. But the door was closed. There was no way out. In a panic, I leaned against the wall. "Rachel." The voice echoed directly inside my mind. I felt like I was losing my sanity. A voice inside me told me that this thing was no longer human, but was once part of the experiments here. "What do you want?" I shouted. My voice echoed in the walls of the room, but no answer came. Suddenly, the projector in the room turned on again. This time, words appeared on the wall. "Experiment 68. awakening complete, and beneath it another note. No escape. The door suddenly opened by itself. Without hesitating for a moment, I ran out, hearing footsteps behind me. It was following me. While running through the corridor, I saw an old exit sign. As I moved towards the direction it pointed, the footsteps behind me quickened. My breath was tight, and my feet felt like they were stuck to the floor. But finally, I reached the broken down door and shoved it with all my strength. When I stepped outside, I had reached the forest just before dawn. The cold air filled my lungs, and I paused for a moment to look back. There was no movement in the windows of the hospital building, but I could feel it. It was watching me with its eyes. In that moment, I understood. This hospital was not just a building. Something was trapped inside, and that thing was waiting for the day it would be free. As I ran through the forest, I couldn't even bring myself to look around. My feet were sinking into the mud, and branches were cutting across my face. But these physical pains were nothing compared to the terror inside me. The cold breath I felt while escaping the hospital was still on my mind. After a while, exhausted, I collapsed to the ground. My eyes were filled with tears. Was I still alone in the forest? Or was that creature still following me? My heart was racing. There was no sound around me, but the silence itself was pressing down on me in a threatening way. I clutched my camera. Instinctively, I opened the screen and checked the recordings. My fingers were trembling, but I had to see. The first image that came up on the screen was the last recording I made in the projector room. However, something was different this time. Something I hadn't seen when I first entered the room, hidden in the darkness, was now clearly visible on the camera recording. One of the walls was completely covered in blood. On the blood, there were words that seemed to be scratched with nails. They left me here. They will all die. As the video continued, at some point, the recording strangely glitched. Static appeared on the screen, and then something flashed for a moment. I quickly paused the footage and rewound to that frame. My eyes locked onto the screen. On the screen were the creature's empty and dark eyes. But this time, I noticed something else. The eyes weren't looking at the screen. They were looking at me, as if they were about to step out of the recording. I dropped the camera from my hand and took a step back. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes. I could no longer tell whether this was an illusion or reality. I continued to move through the forest. About an hour later, I managed to find a dirt road. A few minutes after that, an old truck appeared. I raised my hand and signaled for help. The driver was an elderly man. He looked at me carefully through the window, his expression worried. "What happened to you?" he asked. I couldn't answer. I could only say, "Take me away from here." The man took me into his truck, and we headed toward the town. When we arrived in the town, my first stop was the police station. I placed my camera on the table and told the officers everything. But they looked at me with skepticism. They began reviewing the recordings. As the officers watched the screen, they started whispering among themselves. "This can't be," one murmured. The other leaned in closer to the screen. "This person is on our missing persons list. They disappeared 50 years ago." In shock, I turned back to the screen. The creature's face matched the person they had mentioned. But how? What had really happened at that hospital? I managed to get my story published in the newspaper, but after it was released, things got even worse. Some people, after reading my story, decided to visit the old hospital, and not a single one of them returned.